Good afternoon, Catherine.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm Mark Schmitt at New America, and I'm here with Katherine Mangu-Ward of Reason Magazine. And I guess not. I guess you no longer have a New America affiliation, but you're definitely
That's true. I'm now a
part of the
former
part of the
fellow, which
community.
does not give me very much status at all.
Well, I was a former fellow for a long time, and I milked it for all it was worth. So, but now I'm back here. I'm glad you could do this. We've been trying to do it all week, and finally figured it out. We had two partial snow days during this week. The
And
first
as
time,
is traditional, DC completely lost its mind and couldn't
yeah,
function
yeah.
for those days. So
Well, the first day we were going to do it, my feeling was like today's the day when I actually announced that I'm going to become a libertarian because we got an email overnight from our new mayor ordering us to put chemical to directing all households to put chemical stuff on their sidewalks. I was like, no, I'm not putting that stuff. I do anything to avoid putting that stuff on my sidewalk, and I'm not letting the government tell me to do it. But then it passed, and my libertarian instincts passed quickly. But I had a moment. If we'd done it that morning, it would have been a very agreeable blogging heads.
I'm sorry I missed my chance
You missed
to bring
your
one over to the
chance.
fold. Yeah.
So, well, a couple things.
Snow in DC actually has a way of producing libertarians. If you remember the Marion Barry years at all, I think there were a few winters where no one could leave their houses for weeks on end, and I can only imagine that convinced a few people.
Well, it worked in two ways, right? I mean, I lived here during that period, and it was, on the one hand, you realized like, yeah, the governments could screw up. You also could realize that how much you could actually live without government in the Marion Barry years, if if you didn't need a school system, you didn't need Medicaid, you didn't need any of those things. You could kind of live without it. But I do like DC better with a decently run government. Um,
Fair enough.
uh, anyway, so speaking of decent government or not, we want to talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the things happening in the Republican primary, and particularly the great. I said everyone's talking about it. I do feel like everybody's talking about the return of Mitt Romney, um, in yet another pose. Now he's like going to devote himself to thinking about poverty, which seems like at this point the flip flop ad on Mitt Romney kind of, or turns into the spinning madly around ad as if he adopts yet another posture. But I don't know. I mean, obviously there are other things he's trying to do at the same time as talking about poverty. But that was one of the interesting things that popped out of the kind of announcement that he intended to run again for president.
Right.
What was your reaction to the new Mitt?
Tragically, I'm like already completely over this presidential race, and it hasn't begun yet. So that's probably puts me right in line with the rest of the country. Anyone who's paying attention is already burned out. But no, I think it's Romney said he definitely wasn't running. Now he maybe certainly kind of is running. When you sent me an email before this Blogging Heads and said everybody's talking about how Mitt Romney is going to be an anti-poverty warrior now, I was like, oh my God, I'm totally out of the loop. How did I not see this story? And I Googled it. And the people who have covered it are Rachel Maddow, Salon, and Alternate. So that's
You got my entire media consumption. You got my whole
those
media
were the top
consumption.
hits. So maybe more of a case study in the sort of self-insulating media consumption that plagues the modern world. But no, I think having Romney in the field again is probably not that much of a game changer. I don't think anybody was saying like, oh God, if only Romney came and shook up this pool,
Right.
then the Republicans would really have a stark choice.
Right.
I think what we're seeing is the same thing we're seeing on the Hill as Congress comes back into session, which is this very uneasy tension in the Republican Party between kind of a more mainstream, let's be conservatives, but not be too fussy about it group, and then some people who are trying to be stronger voices, more radical voices on the issues that they think should be the core of the Republican Party.
Right.
And of course, we have been seeing that for a long time with the the so-called wacko birds, and we're going to be seeing that for a while to come.
Right. I guess my only reaction about the race in general is that it feels like, for as long as I've been alive and there have been Republican campaigns, there's always, what gets called the establishment candidate, even though there's probably less of a coherent establishment than there used to be, and, the more conservative candidates. And usually the establishment candidates look like they're, basically going to be better candidates all around for the general election, even if they don't excite the base as much. This year, it feels like you've got three establishment candidates who have some pretty big flaws. Romney's a two-time loser. It's really hard to imagine how he does better in a general election against Hillary Clinton with a better economy than he did against President Obama with a bad economy. What upside does he have really in a general election? Bush, bears the same name as the most deeply unpopular president, and he hasn't run for anything in a very long time. He hasn't done anything, as far as I can tell, since the mid '90s. And Chris Christie, who is, I feel like those investigations are going to be looming for a long time, and should be. So you've got some very flawed mainstream candidates, and you've got some much more solid, I think, really conservative candidates, in Rand Paul, in Rubio, maybe in Scott Walker. That's a little implausible to me. So it feels like it's a little bit turned on its head. Although I noticed that the number 4 candidate in the polling right now is Ben Carson. So he's polling out of a lot of the other people that we're talking about. I'm not sure why that is. But
yeah, the Ben Carson.
Maybe that's all the more reason to not. Maybe that's all the more reason to not pay any attention to presidential elections in years like.
Well,
this.
I do think I'm being sort of grumpy and cynical, but there actually is something to be said for taking everything that's happening now with a grain of salt, right? And there is whatever happens now is not especially predictive. Whatever's showing in the polls now is not especially predictive of who the actual nominees will be, of who's going to win. In my heart of hearts, I definitely want to see a Rand Paul-Hillary matchup, just precisely because of this kind of bizarro world that it would create, in which we have a sort of hawkish establishment Democrat against a sort of somewhat unpredictable isolationist, conservative Republican. I like that. I like the idea of that, not least because I think it forces the Republican Party to decide, are they really going to stick with this kind of platform of supporting what's now kind of 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how you count, failed wars, or are they going to entertain the possibility of kind of doing an about face on that, among other things?
Right, which would mean a very different kind of politics that's not based as much on security. I mean, a lot of even what happened in 2014 was based on building up this perception of global threat, internet, insecurity. Everywhere, which it is a little harder to do if you're Rand Paul and you want to say this is not my answer to every problem. It's a huge challenge, and maybe it's a reason to predict that the Republican Party just doesn't let Rand Paul win the nomination. Although I've always felt like he threads a needle pretty well of basically being a mainstream Republican who's also a libertarian. And that's he threads it much more skillfully, I think, than his dad did.
Right, certainly, and I think there is a template for that, right? Both Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan are templates of how to do that thing, of how to be a sort of popular mainstream Republican who also has a pretty real libertarian streak. Now, is he Barry Goldwater or is he Ronald Reagan? I can only assume that we will see. I would say at least 25 articles in major publications asking that question in the next 6 months. Do you think that's a fair estimate? So everybody will have their chance to weigh in on that. But the idea that Romney making poverty a part of his platform is somehow ridiculous. I think that actually gets, to my mind, it's similar to the way that people kind of scoff when Rand Paul talks about race, right? I mean, he he has made a point for a long time of speaking at black colleges about racial issues. He is his whole stance on criminal justice has a sort of strong civil rights kind of theme running through it. And I think I always find it weird that people who want the Republican Party to move on those topics, that want the Republican Party to do better, when a Republican says, "I'm trying to do better," they're like, "Shut up and sit down." I think Stallone should be like, "Great, Mitt Romney cares about poor people. Good, let's talk about it."
Actually, I mean, I kind of did want to talk about it in a slightly more subtle way, because I always thought, I guess Mitt Romney, he has like the set of diagnoses of things he probably did wrong, or things he got called on, and he did I thought he got a bad call, on the quote that gets cited where he says, "I'm not worried about the very poor," because what
that quote was ridiculously out of context. He was saying, "I'm thinking about the middle class right now. Let's talk about the middle class."
He's saying, "I think there are supports for the very poor, and I'm more concerned about these other things." But at the same time, then,
and he even said those supports for the very poor are not perfect, and I would be. I would be engaged in the project of fixing them. I mean, it was really a totally reasonable statement, which was clipped out of context, but I think was plausible out of context because of the kind of caricature of Mitt Romney that was already out there as this kind of plutocrat jerkface, right?
I think that's right. I'm always puzzled, though, because I feel like one of the big conservative accomplishments of the last 2 decades, and one that has some really good sides, was really, creating a safety net that wasn't just limited to the very, very poor. I mean, there were if Charles Murray was ever right about one thing, he was right in saying that kind of a world where you have welfare and Medicaid and these things, for the very, very, very poor, and then nothing after that it creates a real trap. And sometimes people talk about it in terms of like the implied marginal tax rate of getting out of that situation. You make a little more money and you lose all this stuff. But there are different ways of talking about it. And it was a good insight. And there was a lot of left-right kind of collaboration to say, we actually need a safety net that moves gradually up above poverty so that people can move smoothly out of poverty and still have supports when they're working poor. And it's part of what it is that we have a relatively low minimum wage, is that we're providing these supports. So it's always been there's this ambivalent relationship to that among conservatives where they build that up and then they see it as, oh my God, there's actually 47% who are in one way or another benefiting from this world, which is a combination of not paying taxes, getting AITC, one thing or another. But that is the world we built in order to not trap people in poverty. So that's always what interests me, because then when you flop back the way Ryan has and Romney has to say, well, we really just want to focus on poverty and it's not about all this other stuff. I don't know. I think it's a rejection of a really significant conservative accomplishment that they should be excited about.
I appreciate your attempt to improve America's infrastructure by building bridges there with conservatives, but I actually think your account of things is a little wonky in that, I think most conservatives would say, or many conservatives would say, yes, of course, it is bad design, and this is the Charles Murray thesis. It is terrible design to create massive subsidies for people who are very, very poor and then have them drop off at certain sharp thresholds, because that will discourage work. At the same time, I don't think that's the same thing as saying, let's extend vast amounts of entitlements well into the middle class, right? And this is, this is the idea of saying, okay, well, let's subsidize, maybe we subsidize childcare for working mothers, but, and maybe even food stamps, but then we drop off still relatively quickly after that. That kind of thing, I think, is where that debate should live. But what's actually happened is Medicare Part D. What's actually happened is this sort of basically everything having to do with healthcare in this country, which is now well beyond assistance for the poor and into a middle class entitlement. And the idea that it's good design to help people phase out of poverty is correct, but what Paul Ryan says over and over is, okay, but we can't afford the current setup. So even if you think, you know, it was well designed, we can't pay for it. We need to do something. And the obvious thing to do at that point is not to, you know, fire firefighters and teachers. It's to cut back on, you know, transfers from the young and poor to the old and rich, and, you know, transfers to the middle class. And I think that's, you know, that's easily mistaken for some kind of, you know, cold-hearted fiscal, you know, absolutism, but it's actually, I think, is just kind of a, you know, it is a way of saying, you know, we care about entitlements for the poor. We don't want it all to collapse in on itself.
Right. I mean, there's a big difference between you know, a social safety net or social insurance programs that move well up beyond poverty. I mean, in the case of the Affordable Care Act, mild subsidies up to 400% of poverty, which is around, gets you around median income or a little higher. There's a big difference between that and transfers from the young and poor to the old and rich. I mean, it's, you know, if you want to talk about transfers to the rich, there are those exist. You know, the capital gains
I mean, that's,
preference.
well,
there's
so
certain
there's
kinds of pensions. There's certain kinds of pensions. There's the home mortgage interest deduction. Yeah. I mean, that's not generally what Paul Ryan is talking about.
Well, he's mostly talking about the healthcare and Social Security entitlements, which, you know, they are in fact the biggest. You know, they're the, what's an even bigger gorilla? They're the 2,000-pound gorilla in the room.
Right. And we didn't talk about, you know, it's funny, we didn't put it, an interesting thing to mention it here, at least, is that's totally surprised me, is to see another move on Social Security, because that had really been off the conservative, you know, agenda pretty much since 2005. And,
yeah, I think, you know, there was very much a sense, I mean, certainly this is true at your, you know, your Cato Institutes, your Heritage, your AEI, there was this sense of like, all the stars aligned, and they couldn't do it in the kind of mid-2000s, and so let's just, you know, let it lie and come back to it later. But it you know, it's been 10 years. Maybe it is time to talk about it again. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, they're not quite moving towards privatization, but by blocking the ability to transfer between the disability and retirement funds, you move towards, which is what the House Republicans have moved to do. Yeah. You potentially create a little bit of you either force changes in the disability fund, or you create an overall crisis that forces some sense that something has to change. But it's not like the privatization agenda is all the way back up, but, you know, the groundwork could be laid. But
yeah, and I think I was just going to say, I do think that the kind of lesson of, one of the many lessons of the whole Obamacare debate and sort of subsequent fallout after the Supreme Court decision was that, you know, it's a bit tricky to set up mandatory purchases for, you know, Americans to make from private companies, right? I mean, apparently the Supreme Court is cool with it, but I think a lot of people feel like that's not a fully settled issue, and that is one version of Social Security privatization that could exist. I think that makes conservatives nervous, that they would be still kind of demagoguing the Obamacare stuff, which is, how come the federal government can make you buy insurance if you don't want to buy insurance, and then meanwhile they're saying the federal government can make you buy mutual funds. So I think that's
a fascinating way to think about it, because I mean, in a way, Social Security is almost like single payer if you had a direct, you know, if you're making those analogies, right? I mean, it's single payer, but you have a designated tax for it, or Medicare certainly is that way. So if you switched, you know, the mandate exists regardless, and then, I mean, if I needed to argue for Social Security privatization, I'd argue that, okay, the mandate exists, and you're going to allow people to invest in something other than the Social Security Trust Fund. Right. And you wouldn't, I mean, presumably under any system, you're not going to mandate, I mean, I think it's a terrible idea, and I don't want to entertain it too far, but because I just think you're going to create, even in the best of circumstances, if you did get the long-term equity premium that's sometimes projected, different people are going, you know, some people will get screwed when they retire and some people won't, and that's the opposite of security. So I think it's a terrible idea, but if you did it, you'd still give people the option to just basically get what they would get in the Social Security Trust Fund, right?
I mean, that's most of the
I mean,
proposals that existed
yeah,
10 years ago certainly contain that option. And I think, again, the big difference is like, right now that money is being taken out of people's paychecks no matter what. And, in essence, this is a debate about, well, what do we do with the money after the federal government's already appropriated it?
right.
Whereas the Obamacare thing is like a whole new category of money that the federal government can take from you. So there is a big difference there. But
which you were
yeah,
otherwise, yeah. I mean,
I would be quite wary of anybody telling me at this point, if I like my plan, I can keep it, right? I mean, that's what we're saying about Social Security too.
I get right, and potentially, as with anything, there's a vulnerability to that public. It's like the public option in a lot of people really wanted the public option in the Affordable Care Act. It would have been very possible that the public option could have been kind of a debacle, right? If
Right.
if all the healthy people select out of it, it's a little different for Social Security. Although if lower earners are sticking with basically the trust fund, and higher earners are putting their money in their own investment portfolios, it could get complicated. I mean, one of my views about 2005 was, that the conservatives. I mean, there were a lot of years between that Cato paper. By Stuart Butler and somebody else, calling for a Leninist strategy on Social Security. There were like over 20 years to kind of work that strategy out. One of the big things that I thought happened was they really weren't prepared with the policy and to figure out how certain things would work. So like concepts would come up like annuitization of accounts, and it's kind of like nobody had ever really thought about that. And it's one of those rare moments. I guess it's the rare moment where wonkery pays off. Like it sometimes, rarely, I mean, mostly we live in a world of just political battles, but sometimes being better prepared with just the stuff in a way that somebody like Jason Furman really was in opposition, it really did matter. And maybe you're seeing some cleverness here that makes me think maybe they're a little better, maybe the Republican conservatives are a little better prepared for the fight this time, on the wrong side.
Certainly, there has been a white paper industrial complex in the years since then to hash out a lot of these details. So there are plans, but whether or not what the think tanks come up with looks anything like what happens in law again with Obamacare. Not really, right? It became sort of Franken law, so that seems likely to happen again.
Yeah, I mean, I think Obamacare Act or the Affordable Care Act does have a lot to do with a lot of the planning that was laid in advance. That's both program design and the building some of the political alliances so that people who did advocate single payer, for example, understood what the ACA was and were not necessarily enthusiastic about it, but kind of okay with it. And that's it's another case where I think it paid off a little bit. I mean, sure, the political process makes things a little messy, but I always really think we neglect the work on healthcare that went on way before Obama was elected. That kind of gave him a plan to work with, and maybe some of those mistakes may well precede the presidency to the extent they're mistakes. Now, none of this is possible if one thing happens, right? Some crazy country club bartender poisons John Boehner. Right. And then it all falls apart. So, what's that about?
I mean, I like it that the sort of apparently at least somewhat sincere attempt on John Boehner's life happened exactly at the same time, or nearly at the same time, that he was also being kind of politically ringed by knife-wielding assassins. I think that was there was like a real. If you wrote that in a political novel, people would be like, "Oh my God, it's a little overwritten."
Right. It's like it's those times where you say House of Cards. It's pretty entertaining, but this doesn't really happen.
Yeah. No. Exactly. It's like if this to the extent that the Boehner character is Kevin Spacey, like this is a totally plausible House of Cards plot and like a not very plausible thing that happened in real life, but apparently it did, and I think I always said during the Bush years that I was surprised there weren't some or perhaps more, depending on how you count, assassination attempts, because there really was this kind of, Bush derangement syndrome, right? And people
Yeah, yeah,
really,
yeah.
the kind of Bush Hitler stuff and all that. And then, to some extent, I think it transferred over to Obama on the other side, and this sort of just craziness that people feel about politics. It's hard though for me to understand, like, all right, I am crazy enough to try and kill a major political figure, John Boehner. That's who I'm going to get. You know what I mean? It's like
Boehner derangement syndrome is not really a known thing.
Was it like a crime of opportunity? Maybe,
right.
like maybe he was like, well, that guy's a regular, I can get him. But
well, there's a little bit, right? I mean, one thing about Barack Obama, like Barack Obama and George W. Bush don't sit at the bar drinking red wine, so you don't really have the opportunity to, dump your strychnine or whatever into his glass.
Right. I mean, that's true. There is that as well, I suppose. But I think there is, on some level, this is kind of a broader political point, which is that there's this delusion, I think, that individuals matter a huge amount, particularly people on the Hill. Like the idea that if Boehner drops dead tomorrow, that isn't essentially a good thing for his political agenda. First of all, that there's a certain amount of kind of sympathy rallying around. Like, can you imagine being, one of the people who voted against Boehner's return to his position, and then the guy gets killed, right? Like, you are a jackass, right? Like, any statement that you put out that was like, well, he's not really good for America, it's you're basically an accomplice in his murder. And I think, it's you see that time and time again with political candidates who are assassinated, and then their spouses wind up in their seats, or that kind of thing. I mean, the idea that would have made a difference is both kind of a great man theory of history problem on a larger scale, and also just, in the petty day today, like, is this guy really, is he really got his finger on the nuclear button? No.
Right. Fair enough. I mean, and in fact, right, the power that John Boehner had that pissed this guy off apparently was the guy thought he was one of the country club members who tried to get him fired, right? I mean, it wasn't over the contract with America or something like that, or whatever it is that John Boehner stands for. Anyway. Well, it was definitely a story that added some levity around. It's partly because it wasn't. I mean, I think it was all talk. So I think we could joke about it a little bit, and it added a little bit of levity in a pretty dark couple of weeks. Let me,
and again, at the same time, it was, it did crop up in this moment where, I mean, I don't know. Speaking again of the media bubble, I'm sure your Facebook feed doesn't occasionally serve you videos of Matt Kibbe from FreedomWorks, but mine does. And after the last Boehner vote, there was this video that was Matt Kibbe saying, like, thanks to you, the supporters of FreedomWorks, we almost defeated John Boehner. Yeah. And it's like that's a weird political victory to declare, right? It's like, we almost sort of changed somebody in this one chair in a sort of musical chairs, but the idea that was that he was sort of for a moment this focus of, well, what are the next couple of years going to look like in Washington?
I hear you. It is funny. I mean, my Facebook doesn't. I mean, I don't look at my Facebook feed, but my email and Twitter feed feeds me a lot more of. Thanks to you, we almost got past cloture on the constitutional amendment to, get rid of Citizens United, which is even more further from anything actually happening than the Republicans got to defeating John Boehner. So we each have our things we can the things that actually are just about fundraising when it comes right down to it. Let me. You had an interesting video on your site today or yesterday, I guess, where you had interviewed Campbell Brown, who's now former CNN anchor, who's now leading a lawsuit about teacher tenure. I don't want to go. There's a risk here of going too deep into the weeds of education politics, but because since you interviewed her, a long piece about her in New York Magazine that's really interesting. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, I have to say, as somebody who watches, it's not my main area of expertise, but I kind of watch it closely. The upgrade from Michelle Rhee to Campbell Brown as the face of school reform seems to be a good decision that somebody made. So there's that. But then there's the actual substance of the lawsuit and what they're trying to do and so forth. What did you get out of interviewing her?
So there seems to be a little bit of a, in the constant simmering school reform debate, that we're having a little bit of a Campbell Brown moment, which leads to lots of great headlines about, Brown versus something education.
I know. I only figured that out. I got
everyone.
that. I figured out later that they needed to make that the title of the lawsuit somehow.
Yes. So she is sort of taking a cue from the Vergara lawsuit in California, which opened up some doors in terms of using the courts to roll back certain tenure protections for public school teachers. And she has filed a lawsuit with, I think, 10 other families in New York. And her nonprofit, which has some generic name that has the words educational and opportunity and freedom and stuff in it, is planning to file several others. I have, somewhat mixed feelings about this. On one hand, I think, I do think teacher tenure is a central issue in education reform, and the courts are the place where progress is happening. So, okay, let's do it. I do think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. The idea that we would hand off kind of, what should be local or state decisions about education policy to a judge or a court or a panel of judges or a special body of some kind makes me nervous, because it's gone quite badly in the past when we have done that,
Right.
in terms of everything all the way down to special education plans for students with special needs. I mean, again, all the way up through Supreme Court decisions. Of course, even when the decisions are the right decision, sometimes it leads to a kind of radicalized and even less useful political discussion. So I think there is a little bit to be concerned about that. But the other interesting component is, as you say, Campbell Brown has now kind of drawn the attention to herself. There was a follow-up blog post in New York Mag's website noting that it's actually like people who are opposed to the kind of ed reform agenda on teacher tenure, it's basically the hardest part of their argument. The hardest part of their argument is crappy teachers should be really hard to fire.
Right.
And what they would say is, well, listen, that's kind of a side effect of all these other good things that happen from teacher tenure. But this lawsuit and school reformers are attacking that directly. And so instead of opposing, instead of kind of fighting on the merits, they're saying like, well, Campbell Brown's husband is a creepy neocon, and what does she know anyway? She's just a TV bimbo. And I think, the shoot the messenger strategy has worked in the past, and they're trying it again here.
Right. Well, I have to say, I mean, I mean, like watching your interview with her. I mean, I would not do the. I mean, I think she's smart, and there's no reason that somebody who's a journalist can't, be as engaged and knowledgeable about this issue as anyone else. So I have no problem with that. I did find it a little funny the way, like in your interview with her, you said, "What made you make this change?" And she said, "Well, I became a parent and I saw, that kids had such different choices." Now, I know a lot of parents who, when their kids are in school, they see teachers and they do develop a different view about this. But that's not the situation she's in, because her kids aren't even school aged yet, and she's said she was not sure. She's unlikely to send them to public school. She would send them to Eva Moskowitz Success Academies. So it's not like I experienced this, therefore. So it seemed like a funny answer to give, and it's also seemed like an answer that was an answer about school choice rather than about teacher tenure. So that was a little. I mean, in a way, she is saying I'm the messenger, and she's saying the reason for it in a way that I didn't really find very persuasive. If she was, I mean, Steve Brill did that whole article about the rubber room where the teachers get parked when they can't get fired.
Yeah.
The terrible teachers. I mean, if she'd said, as a journalist, I plunged myself into this, and here's all the things I found, I guess I would find it a little more persuasive. I also think it's a little. I mean, I'm not. Obviously, I've never had tenure. I've never worked at a place where anybody had tenure. It doesn't seem like a super important thing to me in terms of something that would attract people who are better or not. But it is something that people have negotiated. And teachers are right to say it's important to have some protection against being arbitrarily fired. The question of whether whether you should get tenure after 3 years or 5 years, or, what level of offense allows you to end tenure. I'm not sure that's a great thing for courts to do, but obviously, I mean, I could see a lot of cases for going either way on that. I do think it's a little bit misleading. I mean, they're kind of two different questions, right? One is, how much do teachers matter towards children's success? And that's a super complicated question, and there's some different views about that. And then there's the question of, like, should really, really terrible teachers who are inappropriate sexually with kids or whatever, should they be able to be fired? And that's an easy answer, right? In general, but that's not the education question. I mean, it's an education question. If I'm a parent and my kid has one of those teachers, that's a very deep, direct question. But most of the education questions are kind of about all these teachers in the middle, some of whom are better than others. What do we do to make them better, attract better teachers, maybe move off some of those who are not, they're not awful, they're not parasites, they're not crazy, they're not total burnouts, but they're not as good as they should be. What are you doing with them? So in a way, I just feel like the tenure is, it's like the abortion debate when it got turned into, it's all about partial birth abortion, which is this tiny thing about it. That's a very good political tactic, but it's not the actual. That may be
I mean, I guess
that may be a terrible analogy, but that's not the thing,
Your response here, though, I think you just like talked yourself out of your response there, which is like, oh no, actually, what you're describing here, like, take the worst cases, take the most photogenic, kind of terrible situation, and then make that the thin end of your wedge. Like, that's how we do everything. The reason she's doing it that way, that's how we do things.
The real answer for how, like, the other part of it is, what do you do with, I think she had suggested something like teachers who are rated ineffective 2 years in a row. Okay, so that's basically saying we're confident that whatever ineffective means, which is maybe the value-added measures that are pretty controversial, haven't seemed to really work. It's assuming that we have a good enough way of measuring ineffective as a teacher.
It's true.
We know we have a way of measuring terrible.
This is how we do employment in every other sector.
Okay, but that's not okay.
It's not like we don't need this elaborate system that's approved by courts, and that it's like, well, maybe Nick Gillespie and Matt Welsh look at me tomorrow and they're like, your writing isn't very good, your editing isn't very good, we hate your blogging heads, you're fired. They could do that, and that's like not a sign of some kind of deep dysfunction in the journalism industry or like a failure of free speech. That's how jobs are. And I think the idea that there's something special about education is not. I don't know why that would be the case.
Well, whether it is or it isn't, it is the political context, and a public employee union operates in a political context that's negotiating with government. I mean, they've worked out this deal as part of what they think is important to say that teaching is a profession.
Right, but what the Campbell Brown lawsuit is saying is this is a bad deal. The power of these unions is too much. They cut these bad deals. Let's try to undermine these bad deals, and we can start with, let's start with this thing. Let's start with this most egregious case, which is the teacher that hits a kid and keeps their job. And I think, as far as her answer about, I became a mother. Are you watching have you watched the kind of terrible Amazon Prime series Alpha House? Have you seen that at all?
I have not seen that at all. That's the one with the congressman live together, or the
it's like the Congressman Crash Pad. Stars John Goodman.
Right.
It's like
that was the only appeal to it for me was John Goodman. But.
Yes, and so I like watched a few episodes of it, and in one of the episodes he's kind of this like good guy maverick Republican, and in one of the episodes he's doing a public speaking training where he's supposed to be learning to talk to women, and they ask him some question about a tail hook type question, and he starts to give it's a civilian, we're a civilian body and there's a military board, and they say no, the way you're supposed to answer the question is, as the father of daughters myself, blah 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 blah. And in later episodes he comes to kind of feel that that's not only like an effective way, but it's also kind of an authentic way to answer the question. Now I remain skeptical, but I think it's pretty clear, like Campbell Brown knows how to do presentation, and she could say, I read that great article about rubber rooms and I became an activist, and, who's going to buy that? Or she could say, I actually I had some kids, and, my kids are 1 and 3 right now. I'm sympathetic to her view. Like, I'm looking at our educational options right now, and I'm like, ugh, everything sucks. What are we going to do? And it's, I can afford more choices than the typical kind of baseline public school parent a little bit, but still, ugh, they look bad.
Not with that axe of Matt and Nick hanging over your head.
I know, that's true. At any moment, we could be consigned to the worst public schools in DC. Except for no, because DC has an awful lot of pretty good charter schools and a lottery that I could.
Well, DC also has I mean, as speaking as a parent, with a daughter now in 8th grade in DC public schools, there are terrific public schools in DC. And they're improving public schools.
Look at how we just lent weight to our arguments by citing our parental status.
Yeah. But I do think that as a public school parent, I can say more about it than I could when I had a 1-year-old.
Maybe, but I also think when you have a 1-year-old is actually the right time to start thinking about it. When you have a 1-year-old, you're like, well, geez, if I need to move or start a school or something, I need to start.
I do think there's I do think it's very common that people will say, and often people who themselves went to pretty good private schools, so they're not kind of familiar with the world of public schools. They look at it and they say, oh, these public schools suck. I couldn't imagine sending my kids to them. But they're actually not. That's a very it's something they've heard. It's not really, they haven't spent a lot of time in those classrooms. A bad public school doesn't look very different from a good public school,
Maybe, but I guess it's, again, it's similar to other consumer choices to my mind. Like, I don't shop in, the Quickie Mart down on the corner. I've never even walked inside it, but I can use lots of other clues from the way the market operates to tell me that, they probably don't have, lovely fresh baked bread in there, and that I want to go to Whole Foods instead, right? I don't need to go hang out in the Quickie Mart to then have the authority to make my decision about bread purchases, right? But
it may be.
so then I can be crap, actually my options look bad. I can spend $1 million at Whole Foods, or I can have a loaf of Wonder Bread.
Right.
Maybe we should try to fix it.
Right. It's hard to get too deep into this without getting really specific.
It's too late, man. We're all the way in. Just do it.
But there's a kind of glibness about public schools that people have that then lead you to say, well, the solution is, we need a system where we can get rid of all these terrible, terrible teachers. And obviously, I think it's pretty clear that terrible, terrible teachers are a very thin part of the problem, and they don't help you answer the question of what do you do. I think there's 3.1 million teachers. So well over 3 million of them are somewhere between awesome, incredible, life-changing, and kind of mediocre, and you're going to have some of those in any school experience. And how do you make that better? I don't think that's probably not lawsuits. It's probably not lawsuits.
It's not like the school reform movement is let's handle this crappy teachers thing and then we'll think about the rest. There's a huge intellectual flourishing and another white paper industrial complex of how to solve all those other things too.
Right.
I guess I just don't fault Campbell Brown or her backers for saying let's start with this thing.
Right. Well, they're starting with this thing, and then they're also including the teachers rated ineffective 2 years in a row, which I think, yes, there's a white paper industrial complex about that, but there's not anywhere near the point where we could say with confidence that teachers who get rated ineffective 2 years in a row are really ineffective.
Right, although at the same time, right now, in a huge amount of public school districts, something 90% of teachers are rated excellent, right? So, I actually think we can say, at least in those districts, if you're giving the overwhelming majority of your teachers excellent ratings, maybe somebody who can't do what 90% of the other teachers in their district can do that person does deserve a second look.
Well, it depends what the
with
structure is, right? I mean, that may be. I mean, and a lot of those rate. I think where it's 90% excellent is where it's like ratings by the principal or ratings by master teacher or something like that.
Right,
When
which
you're
is
using,
which is
when
still
you're
the
trying to
most
use,
common
when you're using,
way
trying
of
to use
rating.
like the value added, where you're actually norming it, right? You can't do that. I think I'm a
Right,
little
although
over my
there's
head on exactly how you do value added, but
but I'm actually not aware of any districts that exclusively use value added to
no,
determine whether a
that's
teacher
right.
gives their job. Even Michelle Ree's DC at the
Right.
peak of its evil was not doing
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right?
that's right.
So,
That's right. That's right.
you know, I guess I think that's a bit of a straw man, but.
Right. Right. That's
Well, we
right.
got, despite our best intentions, got totally deep in the weeds on education reform, which was probably predictable given who they booked for this blogging head. Let's finish up with one more quick topic. What do you want to talk about? Financial transaction tax?
Well, you know, that's not a quick topic, but it's probably enough to bore everybody. No, I mean, just an interesting moment this past week where, you know, Chris Van Hollen and Nancy Pelosi at the Center for American Progress, or with the collaboration of the Center for American Progress, which is a kind of imprimatur of certainly of Hillary Clinton and of kind of mainstream Democratic thinking, came out with a proposal for some significant middle class tax cuts, the Savers Credit, for example, a set of programs paid for by a 0.01%, I guess, tax on financial transactions, which is a way more the policy. The programs. You know, I'd rather see. You know, I'm not a big fan of yet more tax credits as a way to do social policy. But the idea that we're willing to entertain the financial transactions tax, which is something that potentially smooths out some of the swings in the markets by making, you know, super crazy trading a little more expensive, a tiny bit more expensive. And it has an impact on the financial industry. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's something that had not been on the agenda before, partly because those they're pretty powerful members like Senator Schumer don't want to hear about it. Representing New York and representing the industry, it's not even a corruption thing. That's who their constituents are, or who their constituents that they're attentive to are. Seems like a pretty big breakthrough. Along with a couple other things where there's a kind of opening up of conversation about some ideas that have kind of been off the table for a long time. So I'm kind of excited about it. Not necessarily excited about what it would pay for, but we're pretty excited that it's like the idea bank is a little more open, I think.
I think this is a good example of how Democrats are kind of getting better at, have been better at for a while, producing these kind of concrete policy solutions, right? I mean, this is a great example of like, okay, you know, Mitt Romney's out there saying like, I'm definitely going to do something about poverty, and you know, Democrats are like, here's the deal: it's a 0.01% tax, it's compensated for in this way, da da da. You know, I think this is something that Democrats are good at. I'm a little wary. Well, I'm a lot wary of it, but the element that makes me kind of the most wary is I think it's this financial transaction tax component of the proposal is kind of specifically geared around a special kind of statistical illiteracy that plagues human brains, right? It seems like free money. It seems like, 0.01%, like that's a really small number. No one will miss it on Wall Street. And then at the same time, on the other side of the coin, you're saying like, well, it's so much money is going to be generated from this tax that we're going to use it to pay for all the things in the whole world. And you know, I think we saw that with cigarette taxes for a while. I think soda tax is another place where the same kind of reasoning applies. It's a sin tax, is what it is, and you know, it's a tax that people perceive as being kind of not on them. But the fact is, like, if it's really going to extract tens of billions of dollars from Wall Street's going to notice. And I think, you know, the whole crafting of the plan, which is very cleverly done, preys on this sort of hole that people have in their brains, where then when they hear a very small number, they process it as zero, and that's not actually the reality.
Right. Well, that may be true. I mean, I don't know that they have a real CBO score to show that, you know, what obviously you'd have to do something dynamic with that kind of scoring because there's some kind of trading that presumably there would be less of. So
Right.
there would be fewer trades, and ideally those are trades that you actually want less of because they're creating some instability in the system. You know,
Although it's not clear why that would be the case, right? I mean, if every trade is taxed evenly, you're not favoring bad trades over good trades. You're
no,
just
no.
saying
But
volume is
if your
bad.
business is you're making a million trades a day on which you expect to make half a cent because you're 1 millisecond ahead of somebody else, you're doing that kind of thing. Then it becomes prohibitive.
Right, but
If you have 20 stocks and you sell them every couple months and move them around, it would be inconsequential to you as an investor.
Michael Lewis aside, right? Like, it's not clear to me that in terms of producing efficient markets, which is what we want to do, that the guys who are doing a million half a cent trades are harming markets. I mean, I just don't buy that
Right.
like high frequency, high volume trading is somehow producing less efficient markets.
Right.
And whereas this guy who's making 40 trades a year is somehow producing more efficient markets, like that doesn't strike me as right at all. It may be that for other reasons, for class reasons or whatever, you dislike the guys in the suits doing a million half a cent trades. But I think in terms of the question of like making markets better, which is an
Right.
important question, this tax doesn't do that.
Right. Well, you might want to say that you dislike people who are really engaging in this super rapid speculation, definitely not adding a lot of value to the economy, versus somebody who's making 40 trades a year. You might say that. There are definitely situations where those flash traders cause some instability. Maybe there are others where they cause a little more stability. But it is a kind of a way of getting at a corner of the financial world that seemed that we didn't always have it, and we did okay without it. So I'm not sure it's the most essential part of the world. It seems like if when a tax is so small, no, it's not zero, but it is. It does seem to be something where, like, if it's enough to deter it, maybe the thing wasn't that important to begin with.
I have
Like
to say,
a $5 fine for not wearing your seatbelt is doesn't seem problematic to me because if that's enough to make you wear your seatbelt, you can wear your seatbelt. It's no big deal.
right. I just want to come back to the sentence you said before, which is like, we did really well for a long time without it, so maybe it's not the most important thing. Like, you're a conservative. That's the most conservative sentence of all time.
I plead guilty to being.
I mean,
I'm very
it's
conservative.
horrifying. But I actually think, like, your seatbelt example, which I know is just off the top of your head, but it's a great example of unintended consequences, right? There are lots of people who say, actually, fine on not wearing your seatbelt. One of the unintended consequences of that is disproportionate traffic stops in neighborhoods that are disproportionately black because cops who are racist use that law to their advantage, right? Like, I mean, I think this is it's a great place to say, like, it sounds straightforward, it sounds sort of clearly beneficial with low cost, but there will be unintended consequences. It's a complex system. We're monkeying with it.
I mean,
this is not to say we should never ever,
yeah.
interfere in markets. I don't think that, but I do think this kind of thing sounds too good to be true because it's too good to be true.
Well, I mean, nobody's saying that it wouldn't change the market. Obviously, it would change the market. Now, there might be unintended consequences to them. It might change the market in bigger ways than you might think. But it seems to me like it's a pretty small intervention that most trades that are made for real economic reasons, like I think this company is a good investment of my money.
All trades are made for real economic reasons.
Well, some trades are made for tax reasons. Lots of trades are made for tax reasons. Maybe you'd create more trades that are made for tax reasons because there'd be some gimmick to evade this one. But they're not all made for
correct.
they're not all made for real reasons of economic growth.
I mean, I think you just made my case for me, right? Like, oh, come to think of it, maybe some of these trades would be different, but then maybe people would make other stupid, inefficient trades to avoid this tax. I mean, I think it's like that's definitely going to happen. And again, like I don't. My concern is that the whole thing is kind of motivated by more of a, whatever the leftover echoes of the kind of Occupy Wall Street,
Yeah.
movement, rather than some kind of genuine fiscal, we need revenue from somewhere, and this is the best way.
Well, then in that case, I mean, come over to the side of, treat all income equally.
I mean, that is definitely not a debate we have time for now, but maybe on the next Plugging Heads.
All right. All right. Well, it's nice
a pleasure
talking
talking with you.
Likewise.
Yep.
And
let's do this
we
again
will
sometime.
do this again, or we'll do one of those Google Hangouts that we did a couple months ago. One or the other.
Sounds good.
Okay, Katherine. Bye-bye.